Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Camille and this video is going to be a 2023 reading wrap-up. So in total this year I read 45 books and my original goal was 40. So I actually surpassed my goal by 5, and I'm going to be telling you every book I read this year and what I rated it. So the first book I read in 2023 was The Heartstopper Yearbook by Alice Oseman. I am a huge fan of the Heartstopper series, and I read all of the graphic novels last year, and so my friend got me this book for Christmas. It's kind of like just like extra tidbits. It's not really like a book, so I almost didn't include it, but I was actually really scared that I wasn't going to reach my goal this year, and by the end of January I hadn't read anything, so I was like, okay, fine, I'll include this. But it's kind of just like a tidbit thing, like extra content. So I gave it like a 3 out of 5. It wasn't anything new. So the next books that I read were actually a part of a series. It's called the Shatter Me series. And how the series is kind of set up is there's like 2 sets of trilogies with like novellas in between, which is kind of like short stories. But basically I read the first 3 in that first trilogy in like 2022, and then I was gonna start the second trilogy in 2023. And I liked the first 3. The plot and the story isn't like the greatest thing I've ever read. It's like a YA dystopian series, kind of like Divergent. But the reason why everyone really likes this series is because there's a certain character that is like the like epitome of like book boyfriend or whatever, and everyone really likes the romance. I got to the second set of this trilogy and I just remember I just didn't like it. I don't think that, like, the reason why the stories are great are like the characters and the romance, but the characters were kind of annoying me and the romance wasn't really romancing. And so the only thing that was like its saving grace would be the plot. And so I just focused more on the plot, and I realized how many plot holes are in the series. And so it was just really frustrating me. I remember someone saying that like if I read these books in middle school, I would have probably loved them. But since I'm older, I guess I can like pick up on more things. And I was just kind of like, okay, these books are really annoying me. So the book I read was Restore Me, and I ended up giving it like 2 stars. It was just, I was like, I really don't like this. And then I read the novella that came with it. It was called Shadow Me. I don't remember a single thing that happened in that, and I don't really rate them, and I don't remember them, so it gets no rating. Sorry to the people who love that series. So then the next book I read was Looking for Alaska, which is actually, I borrowed it from a friend. She told me that this is like one of her favorite stories that she's ever read. And it's written by John Green, and he's like a very popular YA literary fiction author. So I was like, you know what, I'll give it a shot if she loves it. So I borrowed it from her, and the book, I loved that the book was different than I expected it to be. What I picture when you're thinking like Looking for Alaska, I kind of imagined the book going in a different direction than it did. And so the direction it took was actually like really beautiful. And it's like this coming of age story about these like group of friends in high school. And it's quite like philosophical. And I just thought that if I had read this book like in high school, I would have probably it would have been really beneficial for the time that you are in high school. And I really liked how it like kind of touched on the topics of like what is the meaning of life. And so I ended up giving it 4 stars because I really liked the like themes that were going on and the storyline. The thing I didn't like is that there's just no place I'd rather be. I would rather be anywhere else except in the mind of a teenage boy. The next book I read is my first 5-star read of the year, and that is Daisy Jones and the Six. This is also my first Taylor Jenkins Reid book, will not be my last. Daisy Jones and the Six is about this band that was popular in the 70s and then kind of broke up, and they're coming back 10 years, I think like 10 years, 20 years later to tell the story of the band and kind of the first ever time that they're like telling their story. And it's like really interesting because it's actually told in like an interview format. So there's no internal dialogue. It's just each person's perspective of what happened as the band rose and fell. And the thing that was really cool about this story is that there's even an author's note at the beginning that says like, you will never truly, because everyone is an unreliable narrator, so you never actually get to know the truth of what happened, which I thought was like really fascinating, and it kind of left me thinking like, what actually happened? But the thing that was actually so fun about this book as well is that this year the show came out, and the actors in that show actually released the album. So like the album that they make in this book of this like 1970s band actually is a real album that you can listen to on Spotify, which was the coolest thing ever. And I was obsessed with this album so much that one of the songs was my top song on Spotify this year, which is just crazy because it's like, it's a fictional band. They are not real, but yet they are because I can listen to them. Crazy. The show was actually also really cool because the way that the show is set up, it's like basically what actually happened. So it's like told in like the present perspective as you get like kind of in between the interview scenes. So it's kind of like the book is like, you'll never know what actually happens. But then the show is like, JK, here you go. This is what happened. And I really liked that. It felt different, and it felt like a different form. Like all the different media forms was really interesting to like be present in, I guess, if that makes sense. Like everyone was reading this book, watching the show, listening to the album. And so it's so fun to like see on TikTok, like being able to like discuss it. So that was really fun. Loved this book. So the next book I read was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, who is the author of The Hunger Games. And this is kind of like a prequel to The Hunger Games. And it's through the mind of President Snow before he's president, like when he's in high school. And it's kind of like the beginning of The Hunger Games and the beginning of President Snow's like rise to power, which was really cool to like read about. But the book was extremely long, a little too long. And it was kind of boring, which I think was intentional, but it made it a really slow read. And being in the mind of it, again, like similar theme, being in the mind of a teenager who ends up becoming an evil dictator, and you slowly see him like become evil, was interesting, but also not fun. It's like kind of not fun to read about. So you're kind of like, okay, are you good? No, you're not. So for that, I gave it 3 stars, but I actually really liked it. And then when I watched the film, I thought the film was a lot better because it was a lot like faster of a pace. So continuing on to another book that is also a screen adaptation, I read The Six of Crows. So The Six of Crows is a spin-off of the Shadow and Bone series, which is on Netflix. And The Six of Crows is kind of like a fantasy heist. So it's probably one of my favorite plots that I read this year because that's such a cool like concept, this fantasy heist thing. And it's like these 6 people that are kind of in a gang, and they're pulling off this like one of the craziest heists ever. And it's one of my first heist books, so I was kind of like, ooh, like this is really cool. And this plot is probably one of the best like executed plots I've ever seen. Everything just falls into place perfectly. But I do have to admit that this book has like 6 different POVs, and I felt like the POVs sometimes were like there's too many characters to kind of like switch in between and follow along, and it was kind of hard to connect to every single character. So for that, I gave it 4 stars. I picked this book up from the library, and the second book was on hold, so I had to wait like a hot minute for the next book. So I read a bunch of like other books in between, and I was really in the mood. I was like, I haven't really read like a romance book yet this year, so I'm like, okay, I want to read like a romance book, but I didn't know like where to begin. And somehow I found this like random book series that kind of wasn't even published yet. Like it just got published now. So I don't know how I found this book. Out of all the like romance books I could have read, I don't know how I ended up with this one. But I'm so glad I did, because it's my favorite series, like probably my favorite book that I read this year, and one of my favorite series now of all time. And this is the Boys of Tommen series. And I think I saw this on like Book Talk or something, or BookTube. And the way that it was kind of marketed was like a sports romance, like YA series. And that's just not an accurate way to describe the series at all. I would say it's more of like a commentary on like abusive households. So that's what I would say is like the forefront of this series. And if you're not comfortable with that, like check the trigger warnings. I can't like necessarily recommend this book because it is very dark and graphic at times, but I just thought the story, it's basically like these children, and they're all like survivors, and they're just trying to survive while also like have a life, and they kind of like interconnect and clash, and they're kind of like, how do I survive my home life but also have like a school life with my friends? And it was such a beautiful story, because the characters and the friends and like the love that they find throughout the series was just so beautiful. But it was also such a heartbreaking story, seeing these kids experience. But yeah, so that was like a 4-book series. So it was Binding 13, Keepy 13, which was about the sister. And then there was Saving 6 and Redeeming 6, which is about the brother. And the brother also goes into even more triggering topics that so again, like fair warning, these series aren't super like bubbly and like happy, but they are very like beautiful and special. Then I randomly read The Great Gatsby. Don't really know why I did that. Yeah, I gave this book, I think, 2 stars, maybe like 2.5. The story just is kind of like weird. I don't really like the story too much. The characters are also kind of insufferable, but the lines and quotes in this book are very beautiful. Like there's certain lines in there that I was like, whoa, I don't know anything about writing, but that was good writing. And so I read The Deal by Elle Kennedy, which is like an off-campus. That's what the series is called, Off Campus. And this was like a true sports romance book. And it's like, it follows the like traditional outline of a romance book with the like 3rd act breakup and miscommunication. And I was kind of like, okay, this is like mid. So I gave it 3 stars, and I didn't continue the series, but it was like, I think it was good. It just didn't have anything special to it. And then I read Archer's Voice, which is another popular romance book. And this one's a standalone, I think. So yeah, and I really liked it. It's by Mia Sheridan. And basically the thing that's really cute about this story is it's like a small town romance book. It's like boy at the small town, or man, he's like an adult, and he's kind of been like ostracized, is that how you pronounce that? Annexed from society a little bit. He's like a reclusive guy, and he can't speak and so no one knows how to interact with him. But then she shows up and she's like, hey, I know sign language. And the guy's like, oh, I know sign language. So then they have this like cool thing where like they're like the only ones who can communicate with each other. And so I kind of liked that, where it's like this like innocent story where they can communicate, and they have like this special secret language. And I really liked that. But it was kind of cringy at time, and there was kind of like filler stuff that was kind of just thrown in there about like random drama in this small town that I was kind of like, okay, like let's dial this back. I gave it 4 stars. I loved the like romance between the characters, but the kind of small town people at times were kind of frustrating. So for that, I gave it 4 stars. And then I finally read the second book in the Six of Crows series, and that was Crooked Kingdom. I also gave this book, I think I gave it 4.5 stars because I connected more to the characters, but the plot wasn't as like perfect. I don't know how to describe the plot in Six of Crows, but it just was like so well executed. And this plot was a little bit more chaotic, but it like kind of delved more into the characters. But I wish that there was just like a little bit more of a balance between the two, I guess. So I gave it like 4.5. I loved it. It was amazing. That duology is so cool with the heist aspect. But again, like it was kind of a lot to follow at times. So 4.5. My next read is Happy Place by Emily Henry, which is my first ever Emily Henry book. And as you can see, I very much enjoyed it. I tabbed it a lot. So she released Happy Place this year, and I read it over the summer. And one thing I just wanted to say is that this is probably one of my favorite covers this year. Like every time I look at this book, I just get serotonin because it's pink. Yeah, the cover is just, it's bright and it's pink and it's colorful. And I just remember anytime I would pick up this book, I would just be happy. Literally because of the cover. But what is the book actually about? The book is about, it's supposed to be a romance book, but again, like it felt like the romance it was more of like a subplot of romance. And the thing that really had grabbed onto my heart and like pulled on my heartstrings was just the dynamic of this group. It's basically every single year, this college friend group goes to like the beach every single year together. And this is their last year getting to do that. And it's kind of like they're all like in their 30s now, and they all kind of have like accomplished careers, and they're supposed to be like adults, but they still don't really know what they're doing with their lives. And they all are kind of like in a very different place. And they feel like they're like, why aren't we like, you know, why isn't our lives like, you know, working out the way that we wanted them to? So you kind of just go through that experience of each character kind of not like having this like internal battle that they're dealing with, and that causes like tension in between the group. And you just kind of get to see that play out throughout the book. And yeah, I just loved that. I loved all the characters. I loved all their perspectives of life. And it felt like one of those books where it's like, I don't know, it just felt like a really important book to read as you're like growing up, if that makes sense. So yeah, 5 stars. Absolutely loved this book and definitely want to read Emily Henry more now. Next book I read was Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I got this for my friend because my friend is studying Japanese, and this book is set in Japan, and it kind of has a couple like Japanese traditions included in the story, and it's kind of like a folklore tale. But basically it's about this magical coffee shop that can go back in time, and it's a culmination of like 3 different short stories, and they're kind of all like intertwined together, but they were just all very sad, kind of a little too sad. And it was like every time you would like read this short little story that's really depressing, and then you would have to read 2 other short stories that are really sad and depressing. And for that, I was just kind of like, this is a little too sad for me. It made me, sometimes when books are so sad, they can kind of make me numb, and that book kind of did that to me. So I gave it 3 stars. I decided to reread my favorite series that I read in 2022, which was the Cruel Prince series, which is kind of like a beginner fantasy book. I think it was the first ever fantasy I've ever read. And essentially, it's a trilogy that, like, the main character's name is Jude, and it's kind of like she's a human in this, like, fairy tale world, and you kind of see her, like, rise to power throughout the trilogy, and that's kind of what it's about. It's like, she's morally gray, she's kind of a villain, and she can be kind of bad at times, but at the same time, you're, like, rooting for her, because she's just, like, so cool, and it's, like, kind of cool to see, like, a girl boss winning. So yeah, 5 stars. Absolutely love that series. And the reason why I reread the series was preparation for kind of like a spin-off duology of that book, and that was The Stolen Heir, which kind of is like 10 years in the future and about different characters. And while this one was about a human in a fairy tale world, these were about like fairy tale creatures in the human world, and they have to like go on this quest. And so I thought that I would really enjoy that, but it was quite boring. The quest just it wasn't really questing, if that makes sense. So nothing really happened until the end of the book, and then at the end of the book, it kind of sets it up for the next book, but it kind of just felt like this whole book was a setup for the next one. And the next one might be really interesting, but this one was kind of boring. So I gave it 3 stars. And so then I jumped into another kind of beginner fantasy, one of the OG fantasy books, and that was the Caraval trilogy. And I actually did a whole like vlog of me reading these books. It's about like a 3-star trilogy, I would say. The books are Caraval, Legendary, and Finale. And basically, it's this magical carnival that like comes to town every year. And it's kind of more like a game, I guess. And so you're allowed to participate in the game, and it kind of revolves around the like people who bought tickets. And so basically it stars these 2 sisters, and they go on these adventures in the like different carnivals, and there was just a little too much going on. It just felt like there's a little too much plot and a little too many plot holes, to the point where I'm like, I really don't know what's going on anymore. It's like, I really don't get it. You know, I'm gonna trust the process, but I don't really know what's going on. So for that, I gave them all like 3-4 stars. You know, I think the last one I gave 4 because it kind of wrapped up the series. Then I read Divine Rivals, which is a duology, and it was just the first one that came out, and it's another YA fantasy. Like, can you tell that like that's what I've been really into this year? I read a lot of those. But this one was like kind of more of a historical, like folk tale, maybe more of, rather, or like, like magical realism, I think is a better term for this series, because the way that the author wrote this story, it kind of feels like a World War II sort of vibe, except that the reason why there's a war is because of these like gods that are at war. And the main characters in the series are like competing journalists, and then there's like letters going on and a magical typewriter involved. So that's all I'll really tell you. But I gave this 5 stars because I really liked the whole yellow journalism. I liked that it was similar to like World War II, and I liked the magical realism of the gods, and you would like learn stories about the gods. And then the letters were probably like one of the most beautiful, wholesome, like poetic thing that I've like read this year. So yeah, 5 stars. Then The Summer I Turned Pretty season 2 came out, and I finished it, and I was like, okay, I need to know what happens next. And I saw Lola Tung, the main character of that TV show, narrates the books, The Summer I Turned Pretty. And so I listened. I was like doing a long drive, so I kind of just listened to the audiobook while I took my trip. And it was really easy to follow. Like, Lola Tung does a fantastic job. And since I already watched the first 2 seasons, like, I was like fine with jumping to book 3, even though I didn't read book 1 or 2. So yeah, and it was quite short. Like, I think I finished it relatively during that time. But all I'm gonna say is that if you think Belly was messy in season 1 and season 2, you got another thing coming in this book. Anyways, yeah, the characters really annoyed me, even more than they did in the TV show. So I gave it 3 stars. But am I really excited to see the 3rd season and watch this play out? You betcha. And then I read my next Taylor Jenkins Reid book, which was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Do you see that? Yeah. 5 stars. The characters in this series are kind of awful, but I kind of love them the same. Basically, it's about this woman, Evelyn, and her rise to fame. She is this, kind of almost like a Marilyn Monroe in the 1960s, and she's kind of like the infamous, untouchable 1960s movie star. And it's kind of like her rise to fame and what you will do to like keep your reputation. The characters in this were absolutely iconic, and the lines, like Evelyn, her lines in this story are amazing. But all you need to know is that she is Evelyn Hugo, and they are just husbands. Beach Read by Emily Henry. This was my next book that I read by her because I absolutely loved Happy Place, and everyone says that they love Beach Read, so I was like, you know what, I gotta know. Basically, it's about these 2 authors, and she writes romance, he writes like dark fiction, literary fiction, but like kind of with darker undertones. And they get like beach houses right next to each other, and they basically challenge each other to write each other's genre. And they fall in love in the process, and yeah, loved it. Gave it 5 stars. Then I read probably the most hyped up book of 2023, which was Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I think this is maybe one of the only adult, kind of new adult fantasies that I've read. So trying to conceptualize this world was difficult at times, but essentially what this book is about, it's if you had How to Train Your Dragon and Game of Thrones and put them in a college, if that makes sense. Basically, this girlie has to learn how to fight a war and gets a dragon. And the dragons were really cool. And this book was really, entertaining, and a really good introduction to fantasy if no one's ever read fantasy before. And so I think that's why it was so popular, and because the romance was really more of a forefront of the series. And I gave it 5 stars, but looking back on it, I can really understand people's criticisms of it. But I was very entertained. So for that, 5 stars. Next we have Solitaire by Alice Oseman. This was another reread of mine. I listened to it as an audiobook last year when I was in my Heartstopper phase, and I never got the physical copy of it because she's redoing all of her covers, and I needed this beautiful cover with her artwork. I really like how Alice depicts mental health, and I felt like at the time that I was in high school, I really related to Tori, but looking back from the viewpoint of someone who isn't in high school and is no longer dealing with the same struggles, it's kind of, you know, a train wreck. And I feel like I related to that, but now at being in a different place, I kind of was like, ooh, she a mess. But yeah, this was probably a 5-star series. I gave it 3 stars looking back on it, but it has such a special place in my heart because it was so helpful in a time that I needed it. So still love it, but more of like a 3 stars in retrospect. So first I'll talk about the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. This was a kind of continuation from the Caraval trilogy, or it's like set in the same world. So they're kind of interconnected, but you can read each series on their own. Like you don't have to read either one to read the other one, if that makes sense. Once Upon a Broken Heart is about this girl named Evangeline, and she's basically just like awful at love, and she's like forced in these like crazy predicaments because of this other main character, Jax, who is kind of like the Prince of Hearts. So he's kind of like Cupid, but a bad one, and she is horrible at love. And they're put together in this like magical fantasy world, and it was just really beautiful. So yeah, absolutely adored this series. I probably would give this series as a whole 4 stars, but I think this one was like a 5-star for me. But yeah, I just thought they were really adorable and kind of a hot mess. But it was really fun. Then I read the Chestnut Spring series, which was basically about this like country cowboy romance book series. I think there's like 5 of them. My favorite out of all of them was Reckless, just because I really liked the main girl, Winter, and I thought her story was the most fascinating out of all of them. But some of them I gave, it was like more like a 3-star series for me. I don't think the cowboys are kind of my cup of tea. This book was really funny. I don't really know why I read this book, but basically there was this new book coming out by Anna Wong, and it was called The King of Greed. And I really wanted to read this book because it was about like a divorced couple, and I've just never read a book like that before. But first off, it was the 3rd in her kind of like romance billionaire series, and so I kind of didn't know what was happening at times. And I guess what I expected to happen in this like divorce series, it just really didn't go like how I thought my mind wanted it to go. And I guess I just didn't know, I hadn't read any other book by Anna Wong before, and so I didn't understand her writing style, and I didn't understand that it's kind of like dark at times. So it wasn't really my cup of tea, so I gave it like 2-3 stars. Iron Flame, which was the 2nd book in the 4th Wing series. And oh, I got the black sprayed edges because I pre-ordered this. But this one, I'm reading them as they're coming out. So I feel like, again, the discourse is probably my favorite part about these books, is that everyone's reading it at the same time. This book, I gave it, I think like 5 4-stars. Again, these books are very entertaining, but the characters were kind of weird. And this book is extremely long. It's like 600 something pages. And I didn't know what was going on for like majority of it. And then the romance was kind of weird. So I give it like 4 stars because, again, it's very entertaining and the dragons are so fun. Next I read Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. And this book is a childhood, like, friends to lovers, second chance romance. And there are a lot of things that I liked in this book, but basically one of the big, like, plot points of this is that these two friends don't talk for 10 years, and you don't figure out why they don't talk until the end of the book. And so I guess you don't really, like, they never discuss the main reason why they're not talking. But at the end of the book, when you find out what happened, I just remember feeling like really icky. But besides that, the story was like cute, but I guess I just kind of got uncomfortable when I found out what happened. And so for that, I gave it like 3 stars. And I wish that they would have like communicated more about what happened. Felt like you find out what happens and then they're like, okay, move on, we're together and we're happy. And I was like, huh? Like, y'all need help. So then I was thinking about the books that I want to read in 2024. And I realized I was going to tackle some big series. And so I feel like I should finish the only big series that I've ever read, which was the Shatter Me series. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to push through and I'm going to read these books. And again, I read Restore Me in like January. It's now December. So I'm like, I'm going to push through and I'm going to finish these books. Yeah, basically the same issues that I had in the first book are the same issues that I had in the rest of the series. So in Defy Me, and then Imagine Me, which were the 2 books, and then Reveal Me and Believe Me in the 2 novellas, I think I gave them all roughly like 3 stars. I wasn't as frustrated as I was in Restore Me, but I think I should have just DNF'd this series. So yeah, I just wanted to finish it. I did. And that was the last book I read in 2023. So in overall, I got a lot of 5 stars this year, but I also got a lot of 3 stars. So I'm gonna give this book this year a 4-star year. I had a lot of fun. I read a lot of books. I felt like I engaged a lot more with the reading community, which I really liked, and I'm really excited to read more books in 2024. So thank you for watching if you're still here at this point. Bye-bye.